Hello, and welcome to the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies Open Seminar Series for 2014-15. My name is Hannah Curtis, and I'm the organiser of the series for this academic year. The Open Seminars are a series of seminars that take place through the academic year, roughly on a monthly basis, and they are an opportunity for us to invite speakers to talk on a subject of interest to them that has links to psychoanalysis. The series is open to all members of the university, students and staff, and also to the general public. The seminars are regularly attended by people who work in the local community, usually in a clinical field to do with mental health and well-being. People such as counsellors, psychotherapists, psychologists, and mental health professionals. As the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies grows, many of our courses and our open seminar series are of interest to an ever-widening group of professional colleagues throughout the health and care sector. Sometimes the speakers are academics within the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies, sometimes they are in other departments in the University of Essex, and sometimes they are speakers who may or may not be academics from outside of the university. This year we have Professor Stephen Groark talking about war and maturity from a psychoanalytic perspective. We have Joachim Willemsen, who is on the academic staff in the centre, discussing the thinking of Lacan in relation to clinical work. We have Jim Hopkins, who is looking at the first year of life from the perspective of neurological developments and psychological developments. And this is just in the first term. In the second term, Christina Wieland, who has just published an important book on the fascist state of mind, will discuss the development of masculinity. From that point on, we have members of the academic team presenting a range of papers on their chosen research, and this will be an opportunity to hear what the academic staff are thinking about and questioning, and also to get to know the academic staff from this perspective a bit more fully. As ever, it promises to be a stimulating series that will give rise to many interesting questions, opinions, and hopefully some very good arguments. We will also be able to learn a great deal from people who have put time and energy and commitment into researching and writing about a particular subject and its links with psychoanalysis. We very much hope to see you at the open seminars, and that you will also benefit from being able to watch and listen again to the talks and discussions. Thank you. We've got Dr. Matt Ffytche, whose title is The People We Live In, Notes on Projective Identification as a Form of Social Interaction. And Matt is a senior lecturer and deputy director of the Centre for Psychoanalytic Studies, and he's the editor of the journal Psychoanalysis and History. He's published on the 19th century history of the idea of the unconscious and Psychoanalysis in the Age of Totalitarianism, which is a collection of essays co-edited with Daniel Pick and is appearing from Routledge in 2015. He's currently pursuing research into the use of psychoanalytic ideas in descriptions of social interactions, particularly around trauma, prejudice and conflict, and funded by the Independent Social Research Foundation. So, thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks. I was looking for an image about taking the couch into the city. And maybe that's appropriate, maybe not. So I'm going to talk about dialogue between psychoanalysis and the wider intellectual world, because that's the theme of my current research, but it's also been my experience of being based here at CPS. But the term projective identification was something I'd only heard of marginally before I came here. Though I bragged about it in my interview. But I've been teaching here from near 7 years, and that very close contact with clinicians working in the object relations tradition has changed that. And this must be one of the few universities where you can study projective identification on the syllabus. And in the main, it's been teaching to non-clinicians, which is crucial, although there are occasionally clinicians who do our MA courses, but often it's kind of putting the word across to newcomers. And I think that's crucial if psychoanalysis is going to continue to function in the wider world. So for me, putting psychoanalysis into the academy is not just about providing an adjunct to clinical training, it's also about developing new insights into psychical behaviour outside the clinic. And this has to be done in tandem with other disciplines. But I'm increasingly of the mind that it won't leave the clinical perspective entirely unchanged, because when techniques and theories are transposed into a different medium, beyond the setup of the analytic encounter, then they may not be mobilised in the same way or to the same ends as they are in analysis. And how could they be, in a way? So, what is projective identification? My current research, funded by the Independent Social Research Foundation, and here again the theme is putting psychoanalysis into dialogue, specifically with sociology and social research. The plan was to focus on two concepts, projective identification and the transgenerational transmission of trauma, both of which concern the way feelings and ideas may be transmitted unconsciously from one person to another. I focus more on projective identification because of its rise in the psychoanalytic world over the last 2 decades, and it's used across all the different schools, including Jungian, but obviously contemporary Freudian and Postgraduate. It's also a term that psychosocial research was beginning to apply directly to social situations, particularly in the context of prejudice and racism. But giving even an initial definition of what projective identification means is a very tricky task. Bob Hinshelwood's definition in his Dictionary of Kleinian Thought runs to nearly 30 pages, and that's meant to be the kind of synopsis of what it means. And it's the longest entry in the whole book. And one of the reasons is that as the term has spread across the psychoanalytic world, it's been put to lots of different uses. You could say that all of these are concerned with how one person projects a part of their self, or a feeling or state of mind, into another person, or treats part of their mind as if it existed in someone else, hence the people we live in of my title. But there are divergences over what that actually means. Firstly, historically, two differing accounts have emerged. One seeing the process as a violent, forceful phenomenon. In Klein's original usage in 1946, it portrayed the aggressive expulsion of an unwanted part of the self, or a disturbing feeling, into someone else, a way of disowning an idea or an experience. But Bion's theorization of the infant-mother relationship developed a more benign version of this, where the process could also aim at conveying or communicating a pre-linguistic feeling, or a non-symbolic feeling. There's another divergence over whether the concept implies an attempt merely to get rid of something, or whether it involves also an attempt to lodge something in someone else, or even to manipulate a part of yourself in the other person. Thirdly, there's a disagreement over whether this process causes a real interpersonal reaction with real effects in the other person, or whether it's just an internal fantasy about such effects. And finally, there's a split over whether this is an infantile and primitive mechanism, or a more normal adaptational one in adults, involved in all sorts of everyday group or interpersonal encounters. And that latter point clarifies why it's been widely applied to social relationships. So these divergences provide one kind of stumbling block. But besides this, the literature typically pitches it as an extreme or controversial idea. It developed out of the study of psychotic mental states and has been used in the analysis of racism and conflict. And this can lead to the idea that it necessarily explodes normal concepts of relationship, or there's something pathological about it, or something that's hard to get a handle on. How does part of someone's mind get into someone else? How do our patients get under our skin? Asked Ffytche Joseph. According to Stephen Ffytche, it breaks down any notion of a clear separation between inner and outer worlds. So a term that confounds categories and which has sometimes been likened to an occult process, i.e. being haunted or possessed by someone else. And in fact, two general attempts to explain the idea by Bion and Klein presented themselves as pieces of science fiction. So this equally hinders the task of putting the concept across to sociologists, who may already be biased against qualitative modes of research, and may be particularly biased against psychoanalytic ideas as speculative, or as useful only for dealing with forms of mental illness. So I'm not yet halfway through the research, so this is very much a preliminary set of preliminary observations, but I'm convinced that there's a basis for dialogue and for placing projective identification into the midst of social theorization and social description. I'll only be able to present glimpses of how this could work. What I'm going to do is present material drawn from diverse perspectives, psychoanalytic and sociological, which I hope will allow people from psychoanalysis to view the idea in a new way. And if anyone is here from sociology, you may get a sense of how it could be relevant for the first time. And I'm going to focus the talk on one particular bridge, as I see it, which relates to dramaturgy, or the use of theatrical metaphors as an approach to psychical and social reality. So dramaturgy has been theorized quite a lot in sociology and social psychology, although no one's really given an overview of all the different theories employing dramaturgical ideas. But it's been theorized very little in psychoanalysis, and I'm not really aware of any instance in which someone has tried to think through what psychoanalysis has to say specifically about the drama of mental life, and join it together with what sociologists have to say about the drama of social rituals. So to illustrate what I mean by dramaturgical elements in psychoanalysis, Freud's use of Oedipus Rex is a very obvious starting point, that he should have correlated his ideas with a Greek tragedy. In the interpretation of dreams, there's a famous moment where Freud borrows a metaphor from Gustav Ffytche to describe dream life as not only different from waking life, but taking place on a different stage. And this brought up the notion of an internal theatre. And this early on became connected with the use of a language of primal scenes and with other descriptions of conscious and unconscious fantasy as representational scenes which could be enacted. Melanie Klein doesn't appear to have used the term drama that much in her writing, but people influenced by her routinely associate her concept of fantasy with a kind of private theatre. For Donald Meltzer, it's a theatre for the generating of meaning, which imbues the external world with meaning and emotional significance. And for Ronald Britton, writing about Anna O, the first subject of The Talking Cure, in an article called Getting In on the Act, he writes, "The private theatre of her daydreaming became incarnate in a bodily-based psychic drama enacted by herself, in which she subsequently involved her family and her doctor in a transference scene." So you have there the terms theatre, drama, enactment, and scene. In the contemporary Freudian tradition, Joseph Sadler, in the concept of the representational world, writes even more comprehensively. The representational world might be compared to a stage set within a theatre. The characters on the stage represent the child's various objects as well as the child himself. The theatre, which contains the stage, would correspond to aspects of the ego, and the various functions such as scene shifting would correspond to those ego functions of which we're not normally aware. On top of this, the motif of the clinical space as itself a stage runs throughout the literature. So for Edward Glover, the patient plays the part of actor-manager, pressing into his service, like the child in the nursery, all the stage properties the analytic room contains, first and foremost the analyst himself. The latter, like the repertory actor, is cast for various roles, only a few of which, if undertaken, would be gratifying to his vanity. And of course, there's a whole history of developments outside psychoanalysis, such as psychodrama and drama therapy, but also transactional analysis with its script theory. So to quote Eric Byrne, a script is an attempt to repeat in derivative form a whole transference drama, often split up into acts, exactly like the theatrical scripts, which are intuitive artistic derivatives of these personal dramas of childhood. So that's just to give an overall sense of the way psychoanalytic thought is permeated by this metaphor. Turning to sociology, Both Glover's and Burns' descriptions bear a very close resemblance to Erving Goffman's approach put forward in the Presentation of Self in Everyday Life from 1959 and many subsequent works. He writes in the preface, "The perspective employed in this report is that of the theatrical performance. The principles derived are dramaturgical ones." And later on, "Ordinary social intercourse is itself put together as a scene is put together. Scripts, even in the hands of unpracticed players, can come to life because life itself is a dramatically enacted thing." And interestingly, he illustrates this with a reference to psychodrama. In these psychiatrically staged scenes, patients not only act out parts with some effectiveness, their own past is available to them in a form which allows them to stage a recapitulation of it. But Goffman was one of the most significant mid-century sociologists and specialised in work on face-to-face interactions amongst strangers in urban settings. So not wholly dissimilar to the psychoanalytic pair. He's not associated with being a fan of psychoanalysis, but mainly because of his book Asylums, which in many ways anticipated the anti-psychiatry movement. And at that point, American psychiatry in the 50s was very closely linked to, American psychoanalysis was closely linked to medical psychiatry. But in fact, in the Presentation of Self, he frequently cites Freud's works on slips of the tongue, and I guess that was Freud's own presentation of everyday life, because Goffman was interested in how people conceal their motives and how performance routines might become disrupted in practice. Goffman's associated with microsociology, which focuses on small-scale interactions, but also with social theory more generally. Its various figures try to give human interaction a more foundational status in sociology. So for Herbert Blumer, the founder of symbolic interactionism, who taught Goffman at Chicago, the totality of such instances of joint action constitutes the life of society. And for Anthony Giddens in the 1980s, the fixity of institutional forms does not exist in spite of or outside the encounters of day-to-day life, but is implicated in those very encounters. So both Blumer and Giddens raise the issue of interaction into a theory of society. And interestingly, Giddens early on attempted to splice Goffman together with bits of Freud and Erikson in his account of society. And that's just one strand of how dramaturgy permeates sociology. Another stems from Victor Turner and his use of dramaturgical ideas to understand social rituals. And then there's a whole tradition stemming from Darwin's work about the expressive performance of emotions in animals that fed into social psychology, which I'll come back to a bit later. So the point is not to equate all this. It's all dramaturgy, so they're all doing the same thing. It's that it provides much clearer ground on which to distinguish what's being said, and a way of putting psychology and sociology in closer dialogue with each other. And also helps to undermine the assumption that psychoanalysis only deals with the internal and sociology with the external. By using dramatic metaphors, sociology implicates its content in imaginative representation, while psychoanalysis implicates the internal in kinds of public performance. And this leads to a first set of points which hinge on the interactionism implicit in all these models. And it's an example of where psychoanalysis can gain support from sociology, because I think at least some of the aspects of some aspects of the controversies over projective identification have to do with the way it transgresses certain assumptions in psychoanalysis itself. One of the qualities that sets it apart from other psychoanalytic ideas is its interactive component. The way the concepts of projection and projective identification are often distinguished is that projection can happen at a distance without knowledge of the person being projected into, but projective identification requires an encounter or a relationship of some kind. Hannah Siegel described projective identification as the earliest form of empathy. For Betty Joseph, it acts as a communication. Thomas Ogden sees it as a transition to an interpersonal framework, and Bob Hinshelwood saw Bion as attempting to raise it to a general theory of the relations between people. So one way of thinking about projective identification is as a re-entry of psychoanalysis onto the terrain of theories of communication and interaction, and that's very sociological terrain. But psychoanalysis has been hampered in exploring these dimensions for two reasons. One is its commitment to the examination of intrapsychic processes within the context of a clinical space, which was set up not to reproduce everyday experience, but to remove individuals from that setup and to create a special laboratory within which one person's psychical processes could be observed and analysed. And the second hindrance is that even though this experimental space is based around the interactions of two people, which some people might consider a basic social unit, this interaction was for a long time, and still is widely conceived, as necessarily an asymmetrical one, with the transference operating mainly one way, and the analyst in the position of observer, who responds not directly to what the analyst then brings with ideas or feelings as if they were having a conversation together, but who ideally maintains a disengaged position as a kind of super-observer of the patient and of their own internal responses. I know that's changed a lot, but it certainly was true for much of the middle part of the 20th century. One of the participants to a landmark conference on projective identification held in Jerusalem in 1984 observed that projective identification is a communication, a bridge. We've done very little research on the bridgehead from the side of the analyst. The growth of interest in projective identification since the 1970s is intimately allied with other shifts that have challenged that classical model. So one is the way countertransference has gradually been viewed as making a contribution to technique rather than interfering with it. And the other is Winnicott and Bion's attentions to the infant mother dyad as a communicative and interactive dyad, in which the exchange works foundationally both ways, which in turn has had a knock-on effect on how communication in the analytic encounter might be conceived. But there's still a bias from the past embedded in the conceptual framework, which tends to set up internal worlds as structurally separate, however much they may be filled with ideas and memories and fantasies of other people. And therefore, if we find ourselves momentarily experiencing someone else's ideas or feelings uninvited, then they have somehow forced their way in, or been transferred onto us, or split off and projected onto or into us. Andrew Samuels captures this well in a remark in his book, The Political Psyche, where he argues that the term projection suggests an empty space between people across which psychic contents are hurled. In the same article I quoted from earlier, Ronald Britton wanted to emphasize how the consulting room can be colonized by the events that should be taking place in the patient's imagination, the other room of the patient's mind. When we locate our fantasies in this other room, a room defined by a physical absence from it, we say we are imagining something. It is the space for fiction. When we misguidedly locate fantasies that properly belong in the imagination in the realm of perceptual space, we have visions. That's all a quote from Britton. I think that's too sharp a distinction between inner and outer, and reality and fantasy, as if they exist in entirely different locations. It certainly goes against the grain of Stephen Frosch's statement that in projective identification, the boundaries between internal and external, between self and other, can't be so severely maintained. Seen another way, by entering the terrain of interactional gestures, the boundaries of the clinical encounter are being challenged, and I think this accounts for the uncertainty in the way projective identification is conceived. One response to this dichotomy has been to suggest there's a range of projective identification, from psychotic experience to, say, the experience of empathy. But I think this solution, although it has merits, misses seeing something about the parallax between normal social encounters and the clinical encounter, which makes it not so representative of the way people interact under normal circumstances. This point was already anticipated by the relational school, who have in fact written almost as extensively on projective identification as Kleinians. Lewis Aron, in his book A Meeting of Minds, describes graduating from the NYU postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis and intensive psychotherapy in the mid-80s. At that time, Stollerow and his colleagues were espousing an intersubjective approach to psychoanalysis that emphasized a dyadic systems view of the psychoanalytic situation that had radical methodological and epistemological implications for the revision of psychoanalytic thought. This is Aron writing. At the same time, we began to hear more about the creative work of the neo-Kleinians, such as Betty Joseph, who was using the concept of projective identification to develop an approach to technique that examined the subtle interactions between patient and analyst. it soon became a pivotal concept linking the intrapsychic with the interpersonal. What I'm concerned with here, though, isn't the debate with which relational school is often associated, over whether there should be more reciprocity between the analyst and the analysand, but addressing how projective identification operates as a reciprocal mechanism in the social world. Psychoanalysis has not been so good at recognising that we're all exchanging and communicating parts of our mind all the time. By looking at traditions within social psychology and sociology, I think psychoanalysts can gain a much more complex view of so-called normal communication, which they tend to assume in rather simplistic ways, and which then forms a backdrop against which projective identification is viewed as something strange, transgressive, or pathological, or unthinkable. Obviously, the sociology of human interaction opens up a vast field, and I'm going to be referring mainly to George Herbert Mead, Goffman, and Marjorie Giddens. The last two I've mentioned already. Mead was actually a philosopher at the University of Chicago, whose lectures on mind, self, and society were published posthumously in the 1930s, but they were taken up by sociologists like Blumer, whose symbolic interactionism was based on Mead's work, and Mead was also taken up by Jürgen Habermas in the 1980s. One of the ideas I want to draw from Mead is the foundational nature of interaction in human behaviour, beginning with what he terms the conversation of gestures, for which he drew on the psychology of Wilhelm Wundt, who was in turn drawing on Darwin's ethology. Mead uses the term gesture to indicate a basic social act, which may be non-linguistic, but which acts as a stimulus for the response of other forms. But Darwin was interested in such gestures in animals as the basis for emotional expression. But for Wundt and Mead, gestures did not at bottom serve the function of expression of the emotions. Rather, they were parts of complex or social acts, and these acts are fundamentally interactive or paired. Mead illustrated this using the example of a dogfight. It's an interesting example from a Kleinian point of view. The act of the dog becomes the stimulus to the other dog for his response. There is then a relationship between these two, and as the act is responded to by the other dog, it in turn undergoes change. The very fact that the dog is ready to attack another becomes a stimulus to the other dog to change his own position or his own attitude. He's no sooner done this than the change of attitude in the second dog in turn causes the first dog to change his attitude. We have here a conversation of gestures. That's all a quote from G.H. Mead. For Herbert Blumer, participants in interaction have to build up their respective lines of conduct by constant interpretation of each other's ongoing lines of action. As they take account of each other's acts, they have to arrest, reorganize, or adjust their own intentions, wishes, feelings, and attitudes. In another illustration, Mead writes, "The stimulating cry, the answering tone on the part of the parent form, and the consequent change in the cry of the infant form. Here we have a set of adjustments of the two forms carrying out a common social act involved in the care of the child." He also proposes the internalization in our experience of the external conversations of gestures, which we carry on with other individuals in the social process, is the essence of thinking. A very similar emphasis unfolds in Goffman's notion of face-to-face interaction, which he defines as the reciprocal influence of individuals upon one another's actions when in one another's immediate physical presence. Some of these interactions come socially prescribed. In Goffman, as an example, Goffman mentions the way nurses, well, he says that they're involved in a ceremonial subordination to doctors when they're in that hospital space. That may not be true when they're outside that space. But in other circumstances, it's down to the parts people assign to each other, or to themselves much more contingently, as a kind of division of attitudinal labour. So he draws another example from middle-class family life. When she assumes a respectful role, he can assume a dominant one. We are talking, it's the 1950s here. But in a way, there's a kind of irony here that this is Goffman's example of how a married couple between the two of themselves contingently decide that the woman will be subordinate. But of course, what he doesn't see is that that's as much socially prescribed as the nurses and doctors. Still, it's an interesting example of interdependent roles from a psychodynamic perspective, and not that far away from Tom Main's theorization of projective identification in the married couple. He wrote, "Certain pairs come to live in such locked systems dominated by mutual projective fantasies, with each not truly married to a person, but rather to unwanted, split-off and projected parts of themselves. So 2 other observations before I reverse the roles and use psychoanalysis to talk about missing dimensions in the sociology. One is that Mead described his work as social behaviorism. In fact, one of his pupils was John Watson, the founder of behavioral psychology. But unlike Watson, Mead did think there was a place for thinking about internal states of mind. But Mead's notion of an internal world is very much dominated by the outside. It's an internalization of the way people see you and the way you're socially described, the meanings people assign to you. So that notion of boundary transgression, of having someone else dictate or insert feelings or meanings into you, is almost the default mode for Mead. It's not a surprise. The other point is that for both Mead and Goffman, much of this interaction under normal circumstances is predicated on manipulation. Some of the psychoanalytic writers on projective identification arrive at an explanation of how the analysand can deposit feelings in the analyst's mind based on manipulation, rather than a sort of miracle of thought transference. For instance, Ogden suggests there's a pressure exerted by the projector on the recipient of the projection to experience himself and behave in a way congruent with the projective fantasy. This is a real pressure exerted by means of a multitude of interactions. And Robert M. Young reflects on the way projective identification can be understood as eliciting something from the repertoire of another person's responses, exaggerating it, and evoking a reprojection of that aspect of their personality. For Betty Joseph, the patient may try to nudge the analyst into a way of acting which is consistent with the patient's projections. And Joseph Sandler responded, "It's not by magic, it's by subtle aspects of the patient's nonverbal behaviour, linguistic style, and so forth." So for Mead and Goffman, the ability to pressure someone into a role or response is again of the essence under normal circumstances of social interaction. Goffman writes in a later work, Strategic Interaction, "In every social situation we can find a sense in which one participant will be an observer and another will be a subject with something to gain from manipulating the process. Or in the presentation of self, he may wish to ensure sufficient harmony so that the interaction can be sustained, or to defraud, get rid of, confuse, mislead, antagonize, or insult his interlocutor. It will be in his interest to control the conduct of the others, especially their responsive treatment of him," which is rather reminiscent of Eric Burns' description of human transaction. In any social aggregation, the individual will strive to engage in transactions which are related to his favoured games. He will strive to play games which are related to his script, and he will strive to obtain the greatest primary gain from each engagement. And this is in fact another instance where Goffman silently adopts ideas from ego psychology. An individual employs strategies and tactics, Goffman writes, to protect his own projections, and he refers to this as a defensive practice. So this negative, rather cynical view of human relations provoked some attacks on Goffman's work from other sociologists. The whole model of dramaturgy was seen as one predicated on the idea that all our actions are a kind of pretense designed to dupe other people. And it's true that Goffman was very interested in salespeople, confidence men, and so on. But of course, these aspects do bring him quite close to Freud's view, who equally has a fairly jaded view of human relations, and the division between what people profess and what they actually conceal inside themselves, or what they desire. To bring them even closer, Goffman makes an interesting remark about the way the need to conceal things from other people can lead to concealing them from yourself. There will be things he knows, or has known, that he will not be able to tell himself. This intricate maneuver of self-delusion constantly occurs. Psychoanalysts have provided us with beautiful field data of this kind under the headings of repression and dissociation. It is not often you hear major sociologists talking about the beautiful field data from psychoanalysis. The one simple overall point here is that there are more correlations than you think between psychoanalytic and sociological models, particularly when you concentrate not on models of the self, but on models of interaction and encounter. And that's where projective identification seems to point. And secondly, just on the issue of interaction, it's not that there's an exact correspondence between what Goffman or Mead is describing and what psychoanalysts call projective identification. But if you set projective identification in the framework of these accounts of reciprocal relations, conscious and unconscious, then some aspects of the concept that seem speculative or confusing start to appear less so. According to Mead and Goffman, we're all the while projecting roles onto each other and anticipating and assigning responses in a way that happens interdependently. However, there's a lot left out. There's very significant aspects of the psychoanalytic model that are not accounted for in the sociological theories. So what I'll do now is turn things around. And again, I'll only have time to give some brief snapshots, but I'm assuming that you're more familiar with the psychoanalytic material than the sociological stuff. And the first and most obvious thing is that all these sociological theories are missing a notion of fantasy. They're not even aware of a structural gap in their theories where you should insert fantasy as a question. I think the model of dramaturgy is helpful again for joining up these pieces. So right at the opening of his book on everyday interaction, Goffman writes, "The stage presents things that are make-believe. Presumably life presents things that are real and sometimes well rehearsed." So there's an image of objective reality without make-believe that Goffman is very keen to cling to. At the same time, nearly all of the analyses in his book are about the way much of this reality is necessarily make-believe for the individuals who compose reality through their interactions. He proposes we live by inference, and that the true or real attitudes, beliefs, and emotions of the individual can be ascertained only indirectly through his avowals or through what appears to be involuntary expressive behaviour. And he places both true and real in scare quotes. So what he's acknowledging is that our experience and construction of reality is necessarily very much mediated by processes of conjecture. And I'd argue that these can't be kept clear of fantasy either. And there's one sentence in the book where this became very clear to me. He writes, "To stay in one's room, away from the place where the party is given, or away from where the practitioner attends his client, is to stay away from where reality is being performed. The world, in truth, is a wedding." There's two things I want to draw out here. One is that having spent a lot of the book demonstrating how in practice significant moments of this party are taking place privately in people's minds, concealed from everyone else, and concealed even from themselves, he now pathologizes internal life, implying that private space is less real than collective transactional reality. But more importantly, he suggests that collective reality can be apprehended through so simple a gesture as stepping outside through your front door, as if this wasn't a situation in which you're just as likely to be duped by other people, if that's the way you see the world. And also, why is the real world a wedding, rather than being pursued by an axe murderer or something totally different? He could have said anything there. I think that what psychoanalysis holds is a theory and a huge body of data concerning the logic by which people image interrelations and interactions internally, which accords a significant structural place to fantasy and the particular emotional and unconscious dynamics which accompany it. So if from a sociological point of view, psychoanalysis is a bit light in the way it theorizes interaction, a bit sort of behind on that front, sociologists tend not to, are more rudimentary when it comes to describing internal life. And they tend not to draw from actual observations of internal life, and when they do construct it, it's not normally meant as an accurate portrait of mental life. There's a way of extending a model of social interaction into a notionally personal space. If externally we have a stage performance, inside is simply an anticipation or reflection of this, with a little bit of space for making choices and things about what's going to be played and how to play it. What this misses is firstly the multidimensional complexity of internal representation. And I'm going to draw an example from Anna Freud's paper on beating fantasies in children, just because I don't want to go down the obvious Kleinian route. I want to look at things another way, of which it has been supposed that the subject was herself, but that's not important for this, for my purposes. So in that paper, and in Freud's related paper, you can trace a fantasy unfolding through a very complex array of kinds of internal representation over time, beginning with inferences of primitive and unconscious experiences, through infantile fantasies that may have been conscious but become unconscious or repressed. Then there are daydreams, which the analysand can recollect, which go through several different permutations over several years. Later in her work on mechanisms of defence, Anna Freud will also write about the games of impersonation that children play as another outlet for fantasy. Then at around the age of 15, the patient came upon a storybook set in the Middle Ages, and subsequently the patient's daydreams went all medieval and were based around a knight holding a prisoner hostage and submitting him to various punishments. And this in turn led towards fiction writing. The patient produced a short story of which Anna Freud comments in a way that's strangely similar to Goffman. By renouncing her private pleasure in favour of the impression she could create in others, through the short story, she turned from an autistic to a social activity and thus found her way back from the life of imagination to life in reality. So that's a lot of different modulations of so-called internal theatre, which allows you to get beyond the notion that internal representation is in any way simple. And there are further stages you could add in by drawing on a text that Anna Freud wrote 13 years later on identification with the aggressor, which in fact goes over similar ground to the earlier beating fantasy article, because that had already concerned the apparently irreconcilable antagonism between one character who is strong and mighty and another who is weak and in the power of the former. But whereas fantasy in the earlier article was seemingly laid to rest in this piece of written fiction, in the later work you see more how the work of fantasy invades and disturbs the ways people confront power relations in real life. So post-war, Bruno Bettelheim famously mobilized the concept of identification with the aggressor to understand aspects of life in concentration camps. And curiously, 40 years after that, in a rather bad piece of analysis, Anthony Giddens used Bettelheim's account in his discussion of routines in the constitution of society. But importantly, every phase of these permutations of fantasy life, from the earliest beating fantasy to the concept of identification with the aggressor, is about the internal representation of interpersonal interactions, in this case sadistic and masochistic ones. So you have a far more complex view of what the conversation of gestures might mean, Mead's term, and what it might mean once it's internalized. And it involves not just a simple scene setting, it involves real people, emotional impulses, daydreams, stories, all sorts of different ways of using your mind. So it's a rather freaky picture I found. I wonder if that child in the middle survived. So to put alongside Goffman's model of the staging of reality, here's a last theatrical vignette from Paula Hyman, writing in 1942. The memory traces of psychical experience, past and present, are not static imprints like photographs, but moving and living dramas, like never-ending scenes on a stage. These inner dramas compose of the subject and her instinctual impulses towards her original objects, who are seen as they had been felt, and are felt to be under the impact of her impulses. So that's a much more complicated picture of the way individuals and others get woven together in reality and fantasy and come to populate each other's minds. And one of my PhD students who couldn't be here today, Tom Miner, has written on this article more lucidly than I could, so I'm going to just quote from him. It's not that there are objects out there and objects in here, objects in here when it comes to the human mind. The objects we relate to in the outside world become counterparts to internal versions, and our relations are coloured by both actions in the outside world and fantasies emanating from within. There is, in a strict sense, no way to tease these impressions apart. They are inextricably woven together in what we call subjectivity. And Hyman added, the sense of reality often suffers considerably from this admixture, but I presume it also gains, and what it gains is our passionate involvement in the construction of reality. So this part of the talk is set to be more contracted than the first part, but I do want to make a couple more points about what psychoanalysis offers, but it's going to be sketchy, so apologies for that. The first point is that another sort of glaring thing that sociologists leave out of their discussions of human encounter, at least in the tradition I've concentrated on, is emotion. Hermann Blumer did acknowledge the feelings, that feelings were intrinsic to every social attitude and had been wrongly minimized by sociologists. Feelings, he writes, arise from unwitting, unconscious responses that one makes to the gestures of others. And he suggests that that feelings might form the foundation of social attitudes. But he never came back to this idea. It's not an idea he developed. One person who did take it further is Anthony Giddens. But if you look in the index to the Constitution of Society, you'll find no entries for emotion, feeling, or affect. They're not part of the Constitution of Society. He does give some space, though, to one particular affect, anxiety. And it's here that he mobilizes the notion of the unconscious, and he draws on Erikson. But his representation of unconscious emotion is very schematic. First, obviously, it's limited to anxiety. In 1993, he discovered sexuality as well, as he's written on transformations of intimacy since then. But the other is that the role played by emotion in his portrait of human encounter is simply a reflection of his overall view of social interaction, which is that it's embedded in routines, which can be viewed as patterns of trust, which can in turn be aligned with normativity. And he uses a vignette of the way an infant learns to trust in the return of its mother. But emotional life is being too easily conflated here with a reality principle, for which day-to-day life, in Giddens's words, involves an ontological security founded on an autonomy of bodily control within predictable routines and encounters. What he doesn't think about is the way in which, once interactions become internalized, they're also submitted to a more autonomous logic, which one might describe as gratification, pleasure principle. Internal life has its own routines of performing emotional and cognitive work, of allaying anxiety or experiencing gratification. And these routines can't be assimilated to social routines as Giddens envisages them. I think this is where the real contribution of psychoanalysis comes in. It's not just about complexity, it's about another logic affecting the whole dramaturgical model. Firstly, psychoanalysis demonstrates the power of this emotional work in evading, distorting, exaggerating or transforming the experience of pieces of reality. And secondly, there's a special logic whereby gratification is achieved by displacing an emotion in fantasy onto someone else, assigning it to another person. So I'm coming back later in the day to this question of living in other people, living by proxy, which for me provides a very broad context that can include Klein and Bion, but also Anna Freud and others. And it's one in which I think you can correlate projective identification with sociological writings, but you can also correlate bits of Klein with Anna Freud, and so on. So as Joseph Sandler argued in his essay on projective identification, Anna Freud explored the way unacceptable aspects of one's own self are dealt with by producing or attempting to produce their appearance in the external object, which is very close to what a lot of the Kleinian writers wrote about. So viewed in this light, her book, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, is a compendium of ways in which people defend themselves against certain emotions and ideas by displacing or projecting them onto other people. Ultimately, all such measures, she writes, are designed to secure the ego and to save it from experiencing unpleasure. She's drawing here on an observation Freud made repeatedly in different contexts, that certain emotions can only be gratified by disowning them. He begins his paper on negation with an example of how someone might say, "Now you'll think I mean to say something insulting, but really I have no such intention," which Freud explains is a repudiation by projection of an idea that's just come up. Meaning the idea is mentioned all the same, but it's kind of warded off at the same time. And that example permeates Freud's work. Elsewhere he associates it with the crime of lèse-majesté, which is an old legal term, meaning a crime against the dignity of a sovereign. As Freud observes in the Ratman case study, under this French law, saying the emperor is an ass was punishable by death. But saying, if anyone says the emperor is an ass, they'll have me to reckon with, is only a very thin disguise of the first version, and it doesn't get you off the hook. So the connection here is that having someone else act out something in your internal fantasy, for instance, having a repeating fantasy of being attacked by someone, or in Anna Freud's case, witnessing someone being beaten, can be a way of secretly gratifying an emotion, while at the same time disowning it, assigning it to someone else. The examples Freud gives concerns insults or death wishes, but the logic's not limited to violent ideas. So Anna Freud devotes an interesting chapter to altruism, describing a patient who, instead of exerting herself to achieve any aims of her own, expended all her energy in sympathizing with the experiences of people she cared for. She lived in the lives of other people. But you may ask, if the fantasy is about someone else's good works or someone else's violence, then surely this doesn't pertain to me. But here I want to link this back to the issue of dramaturgy. And this is where psychoanalysis adds a very important difference to this internal modelling that you also get in the sociological literature. If we go back to Anna Freud's article about beating fantasies, which it began as a fantasy about the punishment of a sibling, and then about her own punishment, and later on became a fantasy about a knight punishing a boy. Firstly, we see there's a strange mobility in the way parts are assigned to people within this internal gesture, and that could only happen as a product of the internal medium of someone's mind. And secondly, of course, Anna Freud's patient wasn't just a spectator of the knight punishing the boy, she was also the knight and the boy and the prison. She was gratifying something through the whole setup of the daydream, irrespective of whether she assigned a particular part to herself or not. And this, to me, is a sign that structurally, the way emotional gratification is being employed in this internal model runs along very different lines from the kinds of anticipatory scheme envisaged by writers like Goffman or Giddens. And one of the crucial differences is in the way emotional events or processes can operate covertly across the boundaries of oneself and another, as they're represented internally. So that, in a way, is my most tentative insight at the moment. I'm using this dramaturgical model to try to capture something about the world psychoanalysis has made its own, the internal world, which has to do with the way, at one and the same time, we use our ability to model human encounters inside to anticipate or to recollect events, as the sociologists argue, but also to perform emotional work, to resolve emotional anxieties by returning to certain favourite scenes and replaying them constantly in our minds. At the same time, we protect ourselves from some of the more dubious or difficult emotional aspects of these gestures by assigning to ourselves a more innocuous role, whereas in fact, we're also using the images of people like puppets to dramatise our own aggression or desire or whatever it is, living our emotions through other people in our head and devolving certain other thoughts and impulses to the people around us. So one final point, which is, so all right, fantasy, emotion and internal theatre may be missing from sociology, but how does it change anything from sociology? There's a tendency to assign psychodynamic processes to a point deep inside the self, sort of deep unconscious. And Freud's original topography encourages this idea, the notion of kind of layered mind with the kind of id at the bottom. And this can lead to the assumption that these deeply interior aspects of motivation are by all means remarkable and different from what one expects, and open a window onto all sorts of unseen passions and impulses, but they can be left out of sociological description for convenience's sake, because what counts in sociology is what takes place nearer the surface, and especially in social interaction with other people. So if the end result is that person A shakes the hand of person B in the park, we could just as well leave out the stuff about internal life. It's not part of the socially realised fact. But as we've seen, these examples of disowning parts of yourself are not buried deep and invisibly inside. They're projected out onto and into other people in real-life social situations. And in fact, Anna Freud emphasised the way in which projection operates in a very different manner from repression. She writes, in repression, the objectionable idea is thrust back into the id, while in projection it's displaced onto the outside world. And that was always implicit in the model, but it hadn't been stated in quite that way. Her analysans, in her article in altruism, didn't repress her impulses. She found some proxy in the outside world, this is Anna Freud writing, to serve as a repository for each of them, which isn't dissimilar from Bion's depiction of projective identification. So in this model, not only does the subject project parts of his or her self-experience onto real others, but does so in a way that activates something within those other people. And we could explore this using Goffman's and Mead's ideas of how we're able to play on a communal repertoire of interdependent gestures. We can pressure someone into playing a role, because all of us share the same kind of models for social gestures. Or we could draw on Sigmund Freud's idea that the ego's choice of a billet for its own unconscious impulses is determined by the perceptual material which portrays unconscious impulses of the same kind in the partner. But even so, this stretches out a tiny bit more, I'm nearly done. Even so, one might argue, okay, we accept fantasies and unconscious impulses don't remain deep inside. They're everywhere meshed with human interaction in day-to-day reality. But if this reality, to quote Giddens, proceeds routinely, for the most part without fuss, and the mechanics of personality are embedded in these routines, then what exactly is the psychodynamic perspective on projective identification adding to the already existing sociology of interaction? And here I'd say that day-to-day life doesn't proceed without any fuss in the main, as Giddens seems to imagine. It's really, Giddens' work is a kind of more boring version of Gottman's wedding party. What's missing from the model is not something to do with internal theatre of gratification, but something in the external world, which makes the psychodynamic material particularly relevant. And this is things like mistrust, bewilderment, conflict, and suffering. And we could consider this at the level of Goffman's microsociology, which is peopled by criminals, con artists, and stigmatized individuals. Or we could consider it at the level of larger collaborative forms of social conflict, mobilized around prejudice, or racism, and ethnic conflict, or gender inequality. In fact, this image is of Chicago burning in riots after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I could have used any model, but I wanted to bring home that this is where all the sociologists I talked about were based, like Bloomer. There's not a world you kind of encounter in their writings. So on these kinds of fronts, violence, paranoia, and the kind of sadomasochism explored by both Klein and Anna Freud, or the fantasies of gratification explored by Zizek, that some social group is stealing our enjoyment, routinely receive a collective staging in reality. Perhaps internal fantasy and social reality are able to reinforce each other when social reality is riven by conflict and inequality, which of course is the case in real life. And if the kind of work people perform internally through the representation of encounters helps to amplify the perception of conflict in reality, or contaminates the perception of others by projecting the wrong emotion into them and pressuring them to conform to it, then it makes a very serious social contribution indeed. I think this is what psychoanalysts of all schools have been stating ever more clearly since the 1980s, and it can't be discounted from any theory of social interaction unless it's one that presumed to exclude conflict from its portrait of society. That's,